Okay, so I'm going to pick up now, and we're going to do I'll do part 2 on the video, but this will be deductions. So once we understand what's income, when is it income, and we looked at the sides of those rules, then we went on to what's deduction. So if we have income, then we have to have a deduction because certain things cost money so you can make money, and we shouldn't just tax you on 100%. Well, we could just tax you on 100% of what you make, but it wouldn't be fair. So we went through. First, so then there's categories of deductions. There's personal, like if you think about it, we went through in these kind of categories: personal, mixed, business and personal, and then business, right? And that's really that was all we covered when we covered in deductions. And the result being personal deductions are going to have really high thresholds to take, and they're going to be disfavored. Mixed, and then business are going to be favored, basically, and the thresholds are going to be easier to make. And if you're in something that's mixed, like home office or whatever, then the question is going to be, does it look more like a personal, or does it look more like a business? And if it looks more like a business, you're going to get it. If it looks more like a personal, you're probably going to lose it, right? So with deductions, the overarching idea being income is broad rules because we need to get as much money into the government as possible so that we can run the government. And deductions take away from that amount of money we get into the government, so we're going to have restrictive rules with deduction. So that overarching narrative plays especially true when we think about the narrow view of personal deductions, because that's the citizens spending money in ways they want to. We don't really care about that. We really care about encouraging businesses to make money, because that means they'll pay more in taxes and employ more people, etc. So the first thing we talked about within the context of pure personal deductions were casualty losses. And we spent a little time on casualty losses. And casualty losses there are lots of different things come in casualty losses. The key things being, whether this was kind of under 165, whether this was foreseeable. And if it wasn't foreseeable, if things happen to you personally that you couldn't foresee, you should probably get a deduction for it. And so the first thing is it has to be unforeseeable, and we talked about what that meant, right? We talked about the neurotic cats. We talked about O.J. Simpson moving next door to you. Right? We talked about lots of things, whether they were foreseeable or not. The easiest thing to remember for foreseeability of the loss when it comes to it is the things that the statute defines as the things the statute defines make the most sense, right? Shipwreck, fire, storm. When they talk about foreseeability, they're like, that's what they're looking for, something that's really unexpected. And other things are, but you're making a second order argument, which is much harder to make when you're saying this is like a firestorm or shipwreck, right? That's what you saw in the Camillus case with O.J. Simpson. It's harder to make the argument that this is what we're talking about with this small carve out to basically act as a second insurance for people, right? That's what this is for. And the way to think about this is we went through the problem. Was it the book problem or one that we went through in slides? I don't remember if it was the book problem or a problem like I created at the time, to go through and show how the 165 was actually computed, because it showed that what this really was just a surrogate insurance that supported, so if you think about what's going to happen is, okay, a tornado goes through Louisville. People have insurance, right? But that insurance doesn't cover 100% of everything. So then the federal government's left with subsidizing that. There's multiple ways they can subsidize it. They can give you more money as relief, but they can also allow you to deduct against your income the cost that was deficient, the cost that wasn't covered by insurance. And that's what 165 is really designed as, right? It's a surrogate insurance policy that if you have income that you can use this with, it helps offset that so the government doesn't have to pay you, even augment the money they pay by subsidizing you with direct payments like a relief fund. So what this is like a surrogate insurance fund for taxpayers. And if you think about it that way, the cases that you lose on, those cases aren't acting like a surrogate insurance, right? O.J. Simpson moving next to you, that's not really what we're talking about with 165. You burning down your own house with arson, that's not really what we're talking about, right? What we're talking about is the tornado comes through. So the marginal cases, if you think about it that way, the goal of the statute, what it's supposed to be doing, maybe helps you understand like how some of these cases may come out if you're having a hard time. So so the first one we talked about that. The second one we talked about were extraordinary medical expenses. So now here's our section 213 again, which are, right, normally you have health insurance. Health insurance covers your medical expenses. So here's like another version of, this is a personal consumption issue that you need to do something that's not covered by, either not covered by insurance or you don't have insurance. So this is surrogate insurance again. And so we're going to be restrictive, right? Because we want to encourage you not to have to incur these expenses. So it's restrictive in that there's a floor, as exceeds 7.5% of your adjusted gross income. But there's also going to be restrictive in the way we're going to apply this. And so you look at Taylor and Henderson and all the cases we talked about, right? The question is, the government was basically like, oh, well, I get it, but you have to prove that your expenditure was caused by your health problem, and that causal link is going to be hard to prove. And why are we doing that? Because we don't want to encourage people to go spend money and try to tie it to this health problem that doesn't exist. I mean, I hate to go back to Seinfeld, right? But there's the Seinfeld was great when they were all going and getting a doctor's note to go to the massage parlor to get like the massages done, because they were like, this is medically necessary, so they go to the dentist to get the note, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about like getting a doctor's note to go get a massage because the massages are great. Let's make it either covered under our insurance. Oh, we don't have insurance. Let's make them deductible under medical expense. Right? That's not what the design of the statute is supposed to do. And then I went through, I gave you a bunch of different, I kind of categorized all the majority of kind of the way cases came out for you to say, like, what's deductible, being like, okay, so causes of preventing sickness are deductible, the cause of the sickness is not, right? So like having birth control pills or vasectomies or abortions, those tend to be deductible because that's preventing this. I don't want to call it having children's sickness, but that's how the cases define it. But having maternity clothes are not deductible, right? Like preventing is, the cause is not. So going to the dentist deductible, but toothpaste is not. Physical therapy deductible, fitness club not, right? So like that's kind of like the cases all sort out this kind of the nuance of it, but it really still shows it's pretty arbitrary, right? It's hard to have a hard and fast rule. So the other personal consumption item we talked about was charitable contributions. So our charitable contributions deductible, yes. We want to encourage charities, but there are limits. So we talked about the limits being if it's a public charity that's a 501c3 like U of L or like your high school or your church or your synagogue or something like that, those are deductible, but you have a 50%, only 50% deductible. If it's another charity called private foundation, which is not quite the same as a public charity, then it's deductible, but only 30%. And if you give property to the charity instead of giving money to the charity, your deduction's limited to the fair market value of the property. And we said, oh, that's awesome. Are all charitable donations deductible? And then we said, well, they're not deductible if you get back a private benefit. And we talked about that in the Ottawa case and the private inurement kind of question, which is it's deductible as long as there's not that quid pro quo. I mean, I still not 100% convinced Ottawa came out right, but we talked about the nuance in Ottawa of what private benefit meant and what the quid pro quo meant. We briefly hit upon like what does it mean to even be charitable, talking about the Bob Jones case. But really the question is just, is it charitable or not? And then we talked about the deduction of interest payments being deductible. And we talked about interest being under 163, which is a great statute if you ever want to mess around and try to figure out like a statute that starts with the general rule. Like the great part of the tax code is 163A is the general rule, but now that general rule is subsumed by 163D, which is the rule, and now the general rule is the exception to the rule. That's how most tax, if you ever want to know how most tax statutes are, never stop reading a tax statute in A, because by the time you get to H, that's the rule, and it'll say, notwithstanding the foregoing, here's the rule. So never, when you're dealing with tax, never stop at the first section. Always read till the end, because there's always, the first section usually gets subsumed. But it talks about personal interest and investment interest and trying to sort through the basketing of it. We talked about this so that we said, look, if it's hard to tell when you borrow money, whether you use it for personal reasons or business reasons. And so we kind of have the tracing requirements. We went through some of the problems associated with it. And we talked about just kind of how silly some of these rules are, but you still have to go figure out what the proceeds were used for. Because if you borrow money and you have the interest deduction is, if I borrow money and use it for business, it's deductible. If I borrow money and use it for personal, it's not. The problem is when I borrow money and it kind of goes into my general spending fund, how do I trace whether I use that money for business purposes or personal purposes? We went through kind of how to address that in class. I think we have a pretty good understanding if you go back and look at your notes on that. We talked about, unfortunately for you all, we talked about student loans, that they are technically deductible, but they're not deductible in any real sense because they're not. They're only deductible because they phase out if you make over $50,000. Well, if you make under $50,000, you're not itemizing your deductions so that they're not really deductible for you. We talked about taxes. Taxes you pay to state, local, and foreign governments, even though they're personal to you, are deductible, and they're deductible because of Section 164. And we also talked about other personal things you pay for, which is kind of raising your family. There's a personal and dependency exemption under 151 that gives you a flat rate deduction for raising your family, right? Even though it's personal to you, you still get a deduction of a certain amount. And we talked about the King case, which who gets to take it is a matter, if you're in a divorce situation, it's a matter of the divorce decree. If you're in a non-divorce situation, that statute won't apply, so it ends up being basically the result of the case. Did you come to an agreement outside of the divorce context that allocate the exemption? And then we just basically hit upon some other things of like personal circumstances. I did not spend very much time on this because we could spend a lot of time talking about like tax policy with the earned income tax credit and stuff like that, but those are personal. Those are the exemptions, deductions that are based on your earnings. I didn't really spend time on it. I don't really test it because if you do Vita Clinic, you'll get familiar with EITC credit stuff, but it's not really pertinent for us other than to understand it exists. So then from there we moved on to Chapter 5, which was the mixed business and personal outlays. And so with the mixed personal and businesses, look, this could be, if it's used for business, it's deductible, and it's going to be deductible under 162 Um, if you're lucky, right, if you remember, the Churchill-Down case helps us sort the difference between a 162 and a 212 deduction. But if you're a business, you want a 162 deduction because it's a straight business expense, that you get a dollar for dollar deduction because it's going to help you earn money in the future. Even if you're in a business context and it's not a straight business expense, it's a non-business expense, you'll still get a deduction under Section 212, but you have limitations like 50%, right? You see that in Churchill Downs, you see that in like the Moss case. You see like the difference between a 162 and a non-162 deduction. So what about these mixed examples? So the first one we talked about, it was kind of really under the category of abuse, but it was kind of like the home office deduction. So he said, okay, what's a home office? Well, it's used for both business, because it's office. I see two words in there, office and home. Home is personal, office is business. Which is it? And so we talked about the special rules under 280A. We went through some of these problems on those problems with the home office vacation home. They're all on the PowerPoint. But really what it is trying to say, like, is this your principal place of business or not? So the rules are, if it is, then it's deductible under those certain requirements. The question is this a principal place of business or not? And the real test is your employer requiring you to kind of conduct business regularly out of that location? And that's going to be a hard test to get. Like Popoff won, right? The violin player won. But I'm not so sure I'd be stocking a lot of, if I was representing a bunch of taxpayers, I wouldn't be really confident every time I walked in with Popoff-like facts, right? I think there's some sympathy in Popoff that the judges felt. But really, they gave you the two-pronged test, but really the question is this required by your employer, and are you conducting business here? And we saw the Mueller case that talked about that too. And we also talked about like decorations in terms of that, right? Those are personal. Well, they can be deductible. We talked about the nuance between deductible personal and deductible business for your decorations of your office in the context of that, the lady from South Carolina, right? The Attorney General. But most of the time, your office decorations are going to be deductible. What about travel and entertainment? So I'm required to work to go to a CLE or something. Or we talked about the Rudolph case, which is you want to go on some retreat. Is that retreat deductible? And basically, it has to be related to directly related to the trade or business. And if it is, then it's deductible, but you have a 50% limitation on meals. The interesting part of those cases were whose business purpose are we talking about? And it's the employer's business purpose, not the employee's. And then we talked about other business expenses that are the mixed use. We talked about lunches, and that was Moss. We talked about entertainment, that was Churchill Downs. And right, these are all things that have both a personal consumption and a business consumption to them, whether they're deductible or not. And right, and the test is, we talked about it over and over again. It's really hard to have like a uniform test you can apply. All you're really trying to figure out is if you can adequately articulate that they're closer to business, to making money, to the requirements of business, you're going to win. If they're closer to personal consumption, then you're going to lose, right? I mean, the threshold that seemed to be the dispositive provision of Moss was they're like, oh, we all have to eat, and all you're doing is eating. You're just trying to tie business to it, and it's not working. But we explored Moss afterwards by going through a series of problems that showed logically you could build up to a Moss scenario and basically have the same result and deduct it. And you even saw Moss. Moss had deductions. The outcome of Moss was don't go to the restaurant, do it at the law firm, and it's deductible. Same food, same everyday occurrence. It just shows how much vague how vague the statute can be, right? The application can be. And then we talked about child care. Unfortunately for child care, basically you don't get to deduct the cost of child care, even though they say it's personal, even though you need to have someone watch your kids so you can work. And same with commuting. And we explored commuting pretty, everyone's got to drive to work. Doesn't matter how far you have to drive. The question is, when are you driving from work and when are you at work? And we looked at that like in Flowers and the Hangs's case, right? And we went through some of those problems that followed. I hit a couple of them to talk about trying to make sure we can sort or identify when are you at home, when are you away from home, where is your principal place of business, right? And same with clothing. So we all have to wear clothes. Unfortunately, that's the way our society works. So because we all have to wear clothes, you don't get to deduct clothes, even if they're kind of required for your business as a decorum, right? Look, we all watched My Cousin Vinny. If you haven't, you can watch it. You can't go to court not wearing a suit. I mean, you could, but the judge may throw you in jail. It's got to be and then as Vinny learned, right, can't be just any suit. It's got to be like you can't wear like a Dumb and Dumber tuxedo suit. You got to wear like a real suit. Otherwise, you're making a mockery of the courtroom. Can't deduct your suit. I mean, right? It seems illogical. It seems like it's a cost of your doing business, but it's a suit. But if Jefferson County Clerk had a suit store there and said this is the official uniform of Jefferson County Clerk lawyers, and you went and bought a uniform, the uniform's deductible, right? Which you're like, wow, that's 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the. If Brooks Brothers was the official clothier of Jefferson County Clerk, and if you went to Brooks Brothers, it was that's the silliness of the rule, but that's the rule. So uniforms count as deductions. Clothes don't. Even if you love the uniform, even if I love wearing my Foot Locker shirt day after day after day, it's not deducted. So if the hospital sold them and required you to wear, so it has to be required by your employer that you wear them, which if that's the case and the hospital sold them, probably deductible. Even if you like to wear them, it's okay. But if you go to like the general medical supply store, probably not deductible because anyone in the public can go there. Your employer requires you to get them, but not that specific kind. So that then there's probably too much personal choice. I mean, it would be a harder case, but that seems to be the way I would sort it. If it had like the stamp that said this hospital on it, then I think it sounds like a uniform. Which are great though. My brother's a doctor and he sends me scrubs that are awesome to like do all kinds of things in. But I mean, but the test is not whether you like wearing them outside of work or not, right? So, and then if you violate ABA rules and you wear scrubs and they ask you for your name and you say doctor, then you're like, we are doctors, right? You will be a doctor. You're just not allowed to say doctor. You can get seated much faster if you make reservations under doctor. That's my own personal advice to you all. You get better seating if you say you're calling yourself doctor. So what about legal expenses? We saw, look, legal expenses, if they're tied to your business, they're deductible. If they're tied to your personal life, they're not. And we looked at that kind of in the Gilmore context, right, which is a divorce. And the court said the cause of it was personal, therefore none of them were deductible. But I went and tried to show you that maybe the court was short-sighted on the way they approached Gilmore. And maybe you could make an articulate argument that probably would be pretty persuasive that we can subsort the expense to what was caused by the personal and what was caused by business, right? But that's the test. And education, which is kind of, well, it could be personal and it could be business. How do you sort education? Well, if you're required to maintain skills by your employer and it doesn't qualify you for a new trade or business, it's deductible. And so the best way to remember that are like CLEs are deductible, but going to school is not deductible, right? If it qualifies you for, like the cop, it qualified him for another job being a lawyer or something. I always wonder, and I'm never sure, I've never heard a good answer one way or another on this, is whether getting an LLM after law school is deductible. Because now you're a lawyer, you're not qualified to be a lawyer, you're already qualified to be a lawyer. This is just another lawyer qualification. It doesn't give you anything other than being a lawyer. We call lawyers, whether you change thing or not. Would that cost be deductible? Because now you're in the trader business of being a lawyer already. This just qualifies you to be a lawyer plus. I've never heard other tax professors tell me I'm silly for thinking that, but I don't know why it qualifies you for something else. If I'm a criminal lawyer and I decide to switch to be a trust and estates lawyer and I go back and take a bunch of CLEs, that's deductible. What's the substantive difference between getting my tax LLM and not? I think it's probably deductible. I promise you don't have any income. But I think it's probably deductible if you worked for a law firm and they paid for it. I think and they gave you salary as you went to school, probably deductible. So if you want to think about ways to sort education. So those are like, deductions were pretty easy because pretty much nothing was deductible unless you met really specific statutory requirements. The mixed personal use were hard. And then we talked about, well, the ones that we spent the most time at the end with were the cost of earning income, like the pure business deductions. Like I'm in business, it costs money to make money, and now are those deductible? And in order to do that, we sorted this kind of in two ways. One is trying to figure out what's a current deduction, which is deductible in the current year against current income, and which stuff ends up being deductible either over time because it's a capital expense. So I either have to deduct it over time in the capital world, or I don't get it deducted till I sell the property. And in order to do that, we said, well, what is it? Like you can remember my limos and my land and my gas if that's the easiest thing to remember for you, or you can look at the cases we looked at. And so we said, okay, what's a current expense versus a capital expense, and that's the Encyclopedia Britannica case, right? So Encyclopedia Britannica says current expenses make you money only in the current year. If it makes you money in more than 1 year, that's a capitalized expense. So most of the time, like your employees make you money only in that year. Things that make you money in more than 1 year are the things that your employees develop, right? The technology or whatever. So if it makes you money in more than 1 year, it ends up being a capital expense. And then whether you depreciate that or you capitalize it depends on what the type of property it is. So we looked at, that can be a hard question to answer. Does it make me money in this year or over multiple years? Because like we looked at Midland Empire, right? Well, I had a place that smoked sausages. I had a leak. I fixed the leak. All I did is get myself so I can keep making money this year. But by fixing the leak, theoretically, I extended the useful life of the building. I made my basement last longer. That's going to make me money in more than 1 year. Does that generate me money in more than 1 year? And that's the question, right? In Midland Empire was answered one way, no. But we saw that it could be just by changing a single fact. If I said it made the basement a little bit bigger, that's now different than Midland Empire, right? Because now I've made myself money more in 1 year because now I've expanded my footprint of my usable space, and maybe that means it needs to be capitalized. So we talked about the nuance of the difference there. It ends up being really hard, right? The Rev rule we looked at, 9438, if you're looking for good black letter law and trying to sort it out, the revenue ruling has it. And then we said the last kind of part of these current versus capital, the initial determination is this ordinary or necessary? Like if you're going to spend money, is it ordinary or necessary to be able to be a business deduction? And we said what's ordinary and necessary we looked at really in the context of Welsh. So trying to say this is deductible or not is really the best place to look is Welsh, because the question is, were you spending money on stuff that was personal or business? And Welsh was a good example of that. This is ordinary. The court came out one way, but you could see the other argument that this was necessary for his line of business. Ordinary and necessary also limited the amount of deductions because it also bumped out things that weren't like reasonable compensation for your executives. That's normally deductible, but it has to be ordinary. It has to be ordinary and necessary. Illegal activities we went through, right? In order to make money, sometimes I have to bribe people. Theoretically, that should be deductible, but we bump that out because we say that's not ordinary and necessary. And then the last thing we covered are once you're in the realm of capital expenditures, certain things get depreciations. Then we have to say certain capital items are depreciated and certain capital items you don't recover until the end. And we talked about like the code classifies for us depreciable property, right? We talked about that, the various classifications. We talked about where to find it. But basically, stuff that's going to waste to zero is going to be depreciable property. So very few things don't waste to zero. Raw land does not waste to zero. A building does. A car does. A fax machine does. A computer does. And so the question is, if something's going to waste to zero, rather than having to wait for it to be worthless and sell it worthless to recoup it, depreciation just allows us to take that as a predictable decline of value. And only thing I would expect you all to know is what straight line depreciation is. And straight line depreciation is just very basic. And the result of the depreciation is, the two things I want you to remember about depreciation is, one, is it a depreciable asset? And if you answer yes, I think if I ask a question, I usually tell you what it is, but you should be able to quickly find the categories. We've talked about them in lots of different contexts this semester. But once you have the category, all you do is you take the years it's depreciable divided by what you paid for it. And that amount every year is what you depreciate. That's part one. The part two I would expect you to be able to do is what's the effect of the depreciation on basis. So when you take the depreciation deduction in year one, you get the deduction, it offsets current income, then you reduce the basis by the amount you took for depreciation. So if I were to sell that asset in year two, my basis is no longer what I paid, it's what I paid less the depreciation. Right? Very straightforward application. And then the last thing we covered at the very end were Chapter 8, capital gains and losses, because I thought it was important to understand the difference between ordinary rates and capital rates, at least theoretically. And capital assets, I also wanted to tie this to, is capital assets then tie to this idea of what we were talking about with assets that make you money for more than 1 year. I just wanted to hammer home that that's what existed. So once you're in business, most of the time you're dealing with, you have capital assets that make you money in more than 1 year, and those are your depreciable assets. But sometimes when you're in business, you can convert what normally was a capital asset into inventory, right? So the biggest category of stuff that you're going to burn up, like if you're in business, it's easy to sort. I'm in business paying the employees current deduction, current expense. That's easy to sort. If I'm in business and I buy an asset, the question is, am I going to use this up in 1 year, or is it going to make me money in more than 1 year? If you're Kroger and you're buying inventory in some people's hands may be a capital asset. Like buying food, maybe, let me think of some food that lasts a while that may be more, wine. Okay, you're Kroger, you buy wine. I buy Dom Perignon wine. In my hands, that's inventory. I'm supposed to be selling that every year. I'm not betting on that Dom Perignon go up and down in value over time. I'm betting that I'm just going to sell it to the consumers at my standard markup of what I'm anticipating on selling it for and buying it for. I'm making a margin between the two. That's all I want, right? But if that's not an inventory item because I want to invest it in long term, I'm me and I'm buying Dom Perignon 99 because I think that was a good year and it's going to continue to increase in price, right? Now, the reason I bought it is to make my arbitrage on the future appreciation of the asset. That's a capital asset in my hands. And so the harder thing to sort in business is, and the way I sort that is things are considered inventory to me if I'm a dealer in the property. And dealers make money not on the underlying appreciation of the asset, but they make money on I'm buying this asset for $100 and I sell it on a retail basis for $110. I don't care if it's going to go up or down in the future. I just care on making this my current margin on the asset. And sometimes things can change. I could say, let's say I just want to buy a bunch of Dom Perignon because I think it's going to be a great investment in the future. And I buy it and I warehouse it. Then all of a sudden I realize, boy, I got a lot of really good wine. I should go in the wine business and I should set up my own store and sell my own good wine. Those assets then became converted at some point from capital assets to me to inventory. And the result is when I sell those assets, I have ordinary income instead of capital gains. And so the reason I wanted to skip to that chapter and make sure we covered it is because that business decision we make, A, it's not static, but B, if you can sort through the reason I buy it and the primary purpose I buy it, am I a dealer or am I a trader in it, that'll help you understand that ordinary expense versus treating things as capital assets. Because capital assets make you money in more than 1 year, right? And certain assets, they can look like a capital asset, but because of who you are, they're just an inventory item, and the cost would be deductible on that year, and the income associated would be ordinary income. It wouldn't be a capital asset. And that's why I wanted to highlight that in the last couple of classes. So I think that covers about all the basic income tax. I did it in 2.5 hours, so that I don't know if that probably longer than you expected, but you're like, why did I spend the whole semester? Couldn't we have just done this? And then learned everything else we wanted to. But if there's questions, like, look, if you come across stuff, this was just designed as like a basic outline. You could use this for your bar prep if you want. This is like a basic outline of what you need to know. You need to fill in the nuance or be able to identify the more complex nuance of this. But at least it gives you an idea of like what, like some of the main narratives I have. Email me if you have questions. I'll try to respond to the extent I can and go from there.